Thank you for joining us for this webinar series on Huntington's disease for the Year of the Brain. This series has been made possible by the Sifton Family Foundation. My name is Sherry Delargy, and I'm the London Chapter President of the Huntington Society of Canada. I'm not only the chapter president, but also a caregiver for my husband with Huntington's disease. Today we have Corey Janke presenting Understanding Huntington's Disease. This presentation will provide an overview of Huntington's, including the cause of the disease, its symptoms, as well as hope for the future. Corey is a social worker with a master's degree in counseling psychology. He has worked as a Huntington's disease support worker in Southwestern Ontario since 1992. He has taken on a new role as the Huntington Society Resource Director for Southwestern Ontario and is responsible for 10 counties including Middlesex, Elgin, and Oxford. Corey's role with the HSC includes providing direct support services to individuals and their families facing the many challenges of the disease, working with 2 movement disorder neurologists in London, and also providing professionals with education related to Huntington's disease. Please feel free to type out any questions you might have at any time. Corey will be answering all your questions after his presentation. I will now pass things over to Corey.
Thank you, Sherry, and welcome everyone to the webinar for this afternoon. As Sherry indicated, today I'll be just kind of doing a quick overview of Huntington's disease. I'm going to show a brief video clip that talks a little bit about what changes are happening in the brain and what parts of the brain are being affected as the disease progresses, and then I will look more specifically at the various symptoms associated with the disease. So Huntington's disease is an inherited degenerative neuropsychiatric disease. It is characterized by a progressive loss of control over movements, thinking, and emotions. HD has a low prevalence in Canada, affecting only approximately 1 in 7,000 Canadians. That being said, however, it is one of the largest genetically passed on diseases that we are aware of. There is a 50% chance of inheriting the HD gene from one of the gene-carrying parents. The average age of onset is between 35 and 50 years of age, and upon diagnosis, the average lifespan is approximately 15 to 20 years. Now, the question of when someone becomes diagnosed with the disease is a difficult one to answer. Historically, that was a time period when the individual was starting to exhibit the physical signs of the disease, and at that point, it was a neurologist that has to provide that diagnosis. What we now know, however, is that there's a lot more happening in an individual prior to sometimes seeing any of the physical changes that are impacting upon things. And so subsequently, because of the knowledge that we have, sometimes people may not exhibit a great deal of the physical symptoms, and yet they can still be diagnosed with having HD based on the clinical presentation that we're seeing in other areas. I think this is fantastic because I think prior to that, we were doing a lot of disservice to people in that sometimes if the emotional symptoms or the cognitive symptoms were appearing prior to anything visible physically, then what was happening was people were losing their jobs potentially because they weren't able to complete the tasks required of them, and therefore potentially losing their extended health benefits, which is necessary as this disease progresses. Or if there was a lot of the emotional or the behavioral changes that were happening, what could have been mislabeled as just difficult behaviors that could cause families to disintegrate and not have the support system in place was something that was not uncommon. So I hope we're doing a better job of kind of getting in there earlier, supporting people in their workplaces, as well as supporting families in order to help maintain as much structure and support in the people's lives as we possibly can. I'm going to now talk briefly about some basic genetic information, and I admit that this is not my forte, but it is somehow important to understand in terms of understanding Huntington's disease. So all of us are born with 46 chromosomes, and we get 23 from each of our parents. Chromosomes are made up of genes, genes are made up of DNA, and then the DNA is made up of bases or nucleotides and there are 4 of them listed above. The ones what we're concerned about are the adenine, the guanine, and the acetylcysteine. And I apologize, I may have just butchered those. In 1993, the Huntington's gene was discovered. At the end of the 4th chromosome, there's a pattern of 3 DNA bases or nucleotides that repeats itself in all of us. However, in a normal individual, this triplet repeat occurs only between 11 and 29 times. In people with the HD gene, this repeat is expanded and it repeats over and over again. Anyone with a CAG repeat of 40 or above will at some point begin to exhibit symptoms of this disease. And in some cases, the repeats can be even greater than 80. In between the normal range of repeats and the Huntington's disease range lies an intermediate gray area. Data continues to be collected in hopes of illuminating the significance of a repeat count in this gray area. But as of now, it is believed that anyone with a repeat count of 30 to 39 will not present with symptoms of the disease within their lifetime. The gene was isolated, like I said, back in 1993, and since 1994 there's been genetic testing available where people are able to go into a genetics counselor or to a neurologist and have their blood drawn. This then gets sent away in our area to North York General Hospital, where it is assessed and information is sent back about whether they are gene positive or gene negative. I think when we first discovered the gene, there was this overwhelming thought that the doors were going to be knocked down out of genetic centers with everybody and their brother wanting to be tested. But in reality, our stats show that only 10 to 15% of the individuals that are eligible for this kind of testing actually get tested. And it's been my experience that most often this is a result of wanting to know their gene status for family planning or for career choices. I'm going to show you a brief video now that was put on by Jane Paulson, who's a neuropsychologist out of the Midwest, who has spent most of her career trying to understand the changes that are happening in the brain to help explain the behavioral changes, the physical changes, and the cognitive changes that we see when we're working with people with HD or living with them. So take just a second for me to get that up and running. Oops.
Huntington's disease, or HD, is what we call an autosomal dominant neurodegenerative disorder. More simply put, this means that HD is a genetically inherited disease which erodes the nervous system. The most obvious effects are progressive loss of control over 3 functions: motor ability, emotional control, and thinking, or cognitive ability. What many people don't realize is that Huntington's disease actually alters the brain, which in turn contributes to the physical and behavioral changes that are noticeable in people with the disease. I'd like to begin by describing what happens when HD physically impacts the brain. Here you see a picture of the brain. In general, the occipital lobe at the back of the brain is where visual information enters, while the temporal lobes, or the sides of the brain, are where sound information enters, and the parietal lobe is where spatial information enters. The frontal lobe, the largest area of the brain, houses some of the highest functions in humans, such as organization, sequencing, decision-making, judgment, and awareness. In this cross-section picture, please notice the almond-shaped structure by the ventricles. It is called the caudate nucleus, and it's the area of the brain most affected by Huntington's disease. When we see pictures like this, people often wonder, how could something so small be so important in a disease like Huntington's? Well, let's look at it from a different viewpoint. Now you can see that the caudate, shown here in green, actually runs through the entire length of the brain, front to back. Situated where it is, the caudate directly affects motor behavior, thinking behavior, and emotional behavior as well. To get a better idea of how these various elements communicate, we can use a variety of different tools. For example, this is what's called a CT scan of the brain. And here you can see a normal caudate nucleus with its plump tissue by the ventricle. Now let's look at the brain of an individual in the advanced stages of Huntington's disease. While it usually takes a long time to show this striking amount of tissue loss, you can see that the caudate nucleus has virtually disappeared. Another tool we use to evaluate HD activity in the brain is called a PET scan, which can actually measure the energy being used by various parts of the brain. The hotter or warmer the color, the more energy activity is going on there. In the area of the caudate nucleus, you can see a series of red dots, indicating that this is a very active area in a normal brain. Now let's look at the PET scan of someone in the very early stages of HD, someone who has not yet shown any physical signs of the disease. Even though a previous CT scan didn't show any structural damage to this brain, you can see that the energy being used in the caudate nucleus has already been greatly reduced. In other words, the tissues are still there, they just can't regulate as much energy as before, and therefore they're not operating normally. If we look at a picture of post-mortem brain tissue, we check by the ventricles to find the caudate nucleus, the almond-shaped sliver here. As you can see, this brain's caudate nucleus shows no signs of Huntington's disease. In contrast, though, let's look at a brain that is affected by Huntington's disease. When you look by the ventricles here, you find that they're much larger shaped and the caudate nucleus is no longer where it should be. In fact, it's completely disappeared, and the space where it used to be has simply filled up with fluid. Well, now let's go back to our original question. How can something so small have such a devastating effect in Huntington's disease? First of all, many different areas of the brain are connected through the caudate nucleus. It serves as a kind of way station or switching site for the circuits as they pass information throughout the brain. For a few moments, let's think of this as a map, showing errands that we have to do today. First, we need to go from our home to the bank to get some cash. After that, we'll go to the store for groceries, then to the dry cleaners to pick up some clothes, and then we'll come home. This road, then, is an important part of our route. If any portion of it were unexpectedly shut down, our schedule couldn't be the same. For example, if we can't get to the bank, if this tissue is damaged and it breaks the circuit, then we wind up at the store and can't buy groceries, or at the dry cleaner without any money to pay for the clothes. In the same way, the caudate nucleus is an important relay station in the brain for many of our activities. The circuits that regulate much of our behavior travel right through the caudate, which acts as a gate to regulate the flow of activity from one brain area to the next. It's actually the main route on the way from the frontal lobe, or boss, of the brain. So if you interrupt the processing of the circuits in that area, then the intended physical activity will also be impaired. Let's think about this another way. Out where I live in the Midwest, farmers control their livestock with fences and gates. When they open the main gate wide, all of the cows can cross back from the pasture and into the barn for milking. If the farmers need to separate each calf from its mother, though, they can simply open and then close the gate, letting the calves and cows pass through one at a time. As long as the farmers have accurate control of the gate, they can also accurately control the actions of the livestock. Therefore, the gate is actually the regulator of the activity they're trying to accomplish. In the same way, the caudate is the brain's gate. It regulates our motor behavior, emotional behavior, and cognitive or thinking behavior as well.
Okay, so Dr. Paulson talks about the caudate nucleus as being the most important part of the brain that's deteriorating because of the Huntington's disease. And because she's from the Midwest, she uses an example or analogy of the gate on the farm. Another way that I like to think about this is that our caudate nucleus is sort of like the air traffic control station at Pearson General Airport. Those individuals that are up there are responsible for organizing all of the activities that are happening in the air and on the ground in order to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So if you can imagine one or two of those individuals falling asleep or not showing up for their job, the chaos that would happen both within the air as well as within the property of the airport. Similarly, that is what's happening with someone with HD. As the caudate nucleus continues to have deficits coming up within it, there are cracks and crevices happening all over in the individual's person. Any questions about any of that right now before I go any further? If so, just I'll give you a minute to type into Sherry, and Sherry can let me know, and I can answer those before we move on to looking at the symptoms.
No questions at this point, Corey.
Okay. So now we'll go on and we'll start looking at the symptoms of the disease, and I'll start with the ones that are most easily recognized because they're the physical impairments. Before I start, I want to just kind of give you the sense that this is a stage disease, so that if I was a gene positive person carrying the gene, I would live a normal life for a period of time until at such point the switch gets turned on and the disease starts to march forward. Once that happens, there's an early stage, a mid stage, and then there's an end stage to the disease. And as I said at the beginning, it's a progressive disease, so it's going to kind of worsen over time. The symptoms that I'm going to show you are often recognized in all individuals living with HD on some level or another, but there's no one path that the disease takes. It's unique to each individual. So in terms of the physical symptoms, initially people might recognize themselves being a bit more clumsy than normal, or they may fall, or they may have an unsteady gait pattern. As the disease progresses into the mid stages of the disease, oftentimes there's a dance-like movement that is involuntary that they start to exhibit, and we know that as chorea. And in the past, prior to understanding the other parts of the disease, it used to be called Huntington's chorea because of this dance-like movement that the individual with HD would experience. Because we now know that there's more devastating deficits that are happening with all of the cognitive changes that are occurring and stuff, we've dropped the name chorea from the Huntington's chorea name, and it's now just Huntington disease. As the disease progresses, people will start to experience communication problems and swallowing problems. And the reason for this is that it takes a lot of coordination for us to be able to kind of put our lips and our tongue in the right position in order to enunciate words properly, to coordinate enough airflow coming in and going out in order to maintain the pace of our speech and or to regulate the volume of our speech. So sometimes people with Huntington's disease really struggle with speaking extremely quickly, or very softly, or very loudly, and that's again part of the disease itself. Similarly, people always start to experience some difficulties as the disease progresses. Again, we take eating for granted, but there's a whole lot of activity that has to happen in order for us to get food in our mouth and into our stomach to stimulate the digestive system. First of all, we have to be able to chew our food properly and get it into a nice moist bolus in the back of our tongue, which then triggers the windpipe to close and the esophagus to stay open so that our food can go down into our stomach and then begin the digestive process. For people with Huntington's, there's an incoordination that happens with all of this, and subsequently lots of times people are unaware that there's food in the side of their mouths, or they can't control the food in their mouth, and so it can often go into their windpipe prematurely, which can result in aspiration pneumonia or choking or some other complications that become difficult. So it's not uncommon for people to have their diets assessed and altered as the disease progresses to try to enhance the safety when it comes to eating food, but also to maintain the caloric intake that they require in order to kind of maintain a healthy weight. Some individuals have a very intoxicated appearance, meaning that a very flat exterior expression on their face. They may appear to be disconnected from the conversation that's happening around them because they aren't kind of demonstrating any facial engagement, but know that they are comprehending everything that's going on, and that they will most often pick up immediately if asked a question and be within the right context, answer their question, and then they may go back into this intoxicated state again. Conversely, some people over-exaggerate their expressions. You know, where you and I might do a gentle smile, someone with Huntington's may not be able to kind of have the control to make that smile gentle, and it might be a very large, overemphasized smile. Again, it's that incoordination that is causing this to happen. For some people, sleep is difficult, so particularly if movements are very significant. Sometimes these movements don't stop when people go into a resting position, which makes it obviously very difficult for them to settle down and to have sleep. Another reason for sleep difficulties may have to do with some of the emotional components of the disease, and I'll touch base on that in a little bit. People with Huntington's can often be experiencing excessive perspiring, or they may have a higher body temperature or a cooler body temperature. Part of this reason, obviously, is if they have a great deal of chorea happening, then it's like they're in an aerobics class 24/7, and therefore they will naturally sweat. Sometimes the area of the brain that controls our body regulation and our heat and cool regulation can be hit by the deterioration of the brain, which then would give them the perception that it's much hotter in the room than you and I might find it, or it might be much colder in the room than you and I can find it. Lastly, if people get to the end stages of the disease looks really quite different. So you might have recognized, as I talked about the physical symptoms, everything seems to be enhanced. There's an exaggeration of a lot of the normal movements that you and I might go through in a day. Whereas as someone gets to the end stages of the disease, it is much more like a Lou Gehrig's disease, where people get more locked into their body and they are not able to engage much at all. They're very quiet in their body, so it looks very different. In my years of working with the Society, I have not seen many people who have gotten to the end stages of the disease, maybe 5 or 6. Typically something else will kind of happen along the way, you know, whether it's Huntington's related or not, that would allow for death to occur and not get into the locked-in stages. I'm going to now start to talk a little bit about the cognitive impairments, and these are the ones that I find give us most challenge because they're more invisible. So again, in the earlier stages of the disease, it is very common that people will start to exhibit short-term memory problems, and these just continue to enhance as the disease progresses, unfortunately. Many people with Huntington's will experience impulse control problems. We all kind of grow up with and learn a social filter that we learn to carry around with us at all times that will regulate the way we behave in certain circumstances. And for someone with Huntington's disease, that part starts to erode itself, and there are holes or inabilities to kind of keep the lid on certain things. So with these people, sometimes there's increased cursing or swearing that can happen. There can be physical violence that can happen because they have the impulse to be angry and they can strike out, even though that would not have been part of their pre-existing personality style. For some individuals, that might look like going down for a walk and they have to urinate and they decide that they should urinate right on the sidewalk. So there's a lot of challenges around the impulse control issues, and what I want to stress is that this is part of the disease itself. This is not the individual most often being a dirty person or someone that's naturally violent. That being said, I want to just kind of caveat all of this with indicating that we all come into life with personality traits that we don't necessarily find attractive in ourselves, and we do our very best to kind of keep those hidden from most people. So when this disease starts to kind of present itself and that impulse control or their social filter starts to be impaired, oftentimes we'll start to see some of those pre-existing more negative personality traits showing through, and they just get exacerbated because they don't have the ability to kind of keep them in check like they have throughout the rest of their lifetime. The next one is a really important symptom because I find that this is one that often will result in aggressive behavior, particularly in long-term care facilities. So individuals with Huntington's disease often will have slowed information processing times, particularly in the mid to late stages of the disease. And the best way to kind of describe what this is like is that when you were driving around London at this time of year, we can set out knowing that we have a 10-minute ride to get to work, and we leave our house in 7 minutes, and all of a sudden we're hitting construction and we have to find alternate routes to get to work, and it's going to take us a much longer time and we're able to get there. Similarly, when someone's taking information from their environment and it's being processed, it's hitting roadblocks, it's hitting sinkholes, it's doing all of these kind of challenging things that we experience when we're driving, and it takes a lot longer for that information to find new routes to get to the area of the brain that it's intended to get to so that we can have a response in a timely manner. I have had the opportunity that I use often as an example. I worked with a woman who was extremely kind and extremely sweet, who ended up going into a long-term care facility, and shortly thereafter I got a call from them indicating that they were having significant behavioral problems with this individual. So when I went out to see her, she was unfortunately in the basement of an old facility that no longer exists. It was a locked unit. This was around the time when Mike Harris had kind of divested a lot of the beds in the psychiatric hospital and put people into the long-term care facilities. And she found herself in an extremely noisy, scary environment in a very small wardroom with 3 other roommates. So when I observed the staff were fantastic. They were doing their best to, be very caring, engaging her in conversation, giving her choices, all of the things that we'd hope people would be getting. But the stimulation was so great for her that after a while she became so frustrated with the constant talking and noise and all that kind of stuff that she would strike out just to kind of get some control back. When I spent some time with her, what I recognized was her response time to a question that I was asking was about 30 to 45 seconds long. And the staff were not acknowledging that, so they would just keep talking to her. And so when she would respond to the question that was being asked at that moment, her answer didn't seem to make sense because she was actually answering a question from three questions ago. So if you're working with people that have HD in a long-term care facility, I always suggest that you try to do their care at a point where you can reduce the amount of external stimuli through television or closing their door, keep the conversation to a minimum, and to do it at a time when you're not being rushed to do that activity. And most often that can kind of keep things more stable for longer periods of time. People with Huntington's probably experience difficulties with decision making and problem solving. Again, they become extremely overwhelmed because the information to make a decision is getting lost within their neural pathways. So if you're working with them, it's much easier if you give them closed-ended questions. Would you like to have spaghetti or a burger for supper tonight? Would you like to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt? Because at that point, you're already giving them the information and they can respond more quickly with the answer to the question that's being asked. People often present as being confused, and again, my experience from talking with my clients is that they go to answer a question and they give a lot of the background information, and by the time they get to the point, they've forgotten what the question is, so they do appear sometimes confused. Lastly, people with Huntington's disease tend to be extremely rigid or stubborn, whatever way you want to label that. And again, that may have been part of their pre-existing personality, but my experience is that most people living with Huntington's disease know what's happening in them. They know the changes that are happening, and like all of us, we fight for independence through routine and structure. And so when we are at risk of losing some of that, we're going to do everything that we possibly can to maintain as much of that in our life so that we have control and we're not as afraid of what's happening around us when our bodies and our brains are failing us. So again, with someone with Huntington's, probably, you know, as soon as the end of the early stages and certainly going into the mid and late stages, memory retrieval is impaired, verbal fluency will be impaired, and word finding will be impaired. Always intact is recognition memory. So if you've worked with someone that has Huntington's disease and you have had really good interactions with that individual, and perhaps you go off on maternity leave and you come back a year later and the Huntington's client is still there, they may not be able to remember your name, but they will remember you, and they will remember whether their relationship with you was good or whether it was bad. Similarly to Alzheimer's, long-term memory is always intact with people with Huntington's disease. And this is a really important take-home as well, that language comprehension is always intact, even in the end stages of the disease. The research that we have indicates that people throughout the disease process always understand what it is that we're saying to them. So always be cautious of that if you're a care provider working with someone with HD and you're having conversations about them in front of them, particularly if they have that kind of flat affect, like they're not present. They are. So again, intellectual speed and flexibility is lost. The ability to learn due to attention and sequencing challenges can pose difficulties with learning. Executive functioning is impaired, as well as the visual spatial sense. Any questions so far?
I do have one question here, Corey. Is it possible that some throat muscles encounter spasms or involuntary movements within and can be result in sounds being emitted from the throat? Also, if the person is continuously sipping air from the corner of their mouth, what is that related to? Is it due to the making of too much saliva or swallowing saliva? I don't see this person sipping back saliva, but she does continuously sip air.
Yeah, so my experience in talking with the neurologist about this is that there are some involuntary throat muscles that are being activated by the chorea, and that results in people kind of clearing their throat a lot, so this could be a constant or clicking their tongue, and the breathing in of the air is probably much more related to this choreic kind of movement that's happening, and that's just the way it's being presented.
I don't have any more questions at this point, Corey.
Okay, we'll move on. So emotional disturbances that are associated. I had indicated earlier that sometimes people have some difficulties sleeping, and this can be a direct response to some very common emotional symptoms that we have of the disease, being depression and anxiety. I would say probably in my caseload, 80% of the people that I work with are experiencing both depression and anxiety, and are likely being treated for that with medication. From the depression point of view, I think that's probably twofold. One is, as the brain is deteriorating, our brain cells are responsible for the production of various neurotransmitters that help stabilize our mood, like serotonin, for example. And if there's a deterioration in the brain cells, or if they're dying and not existing, then it stands to reason that there's going to be less serotonin being produced in order for us to kind of maintain our level. So at that point, obviously, an antidepressant medication can be very helpful at trying to increase the amount of serotonin that is being produced and or uptake, so that we can maintain a more positive mood along the way. Secondly, if you recall, I indicated at the beginning that the average age of onset is between the ages of 35 and 50. So most of us at that age have kind of got our sea legs underneath us, and we're kind of producing, moving forward with things that are important, like our employment opportunities. Perhaps our families are getting started, or we've purchased our first home, or any of those kind of things that kind of start moving us into a more adult stage. And all of a sudden, knock, knock, knock on our back comes the disease. So I think for many people, there's a situational depression that happens naturally as well once they get the diagnosis. And then oftentimes it can be associated with a great deal of guilt if children have already been born. And so, again, two reasons for the depression. Similarly, anxiety is a very significant challenge with many of the clients that we work with. Again, they tend to lose the ability to kind of appreciate what's a big deal and what's not a big deal, and so oftentimes everything's a big deal. We have lots of family members who have to kind of titrate information to their loved ones living with Huntington's disease, because telling them that next Sunday after church the kids are going to come over for lunch can cause a week of high levels of anxiety, because they can think of every bad thing that's going to happen before then. So just maybe telling them the day before or that morning of can reduce the great deal of anxiety for some people. Apathy is something that is becoming increasingly apparent in my caseload, and it's one of the harder ones for us to treat. If you think about activities that we like to engage in, it takes a lot of frontal lobe use in order to get those things going. So we have to plan, we have to initiate, we have to be motivated. And if any of those conditions are being unplugged because of the processing of the disease, then it's going to make people less likely to engage in things that they really loved enjoying in the past. I find that this is probably more difficult for people who are providing care, or family members who have known dad to be a full-time worker who was heavily involved in the Lions Club and went to the grandchildren's hockey games, and now all he wants to do is sit in front of the television, and he seems to be quite content. We would interpret that as probably being a lack of quality of life and be very concerned about that. But my experience has been, for the most part, people that have apathy are quite content. And so, at those points we do work much harder with helping the family adjust to the changes that have happened in the individual because of the disease, than trying to activate the person into activities that they don't necessarily want to be part of any longer. And the last significant emotional disturbance is psychosis. And this, thank God, is not a very common one. They say between 10 and 15% of the population will experience some psychotic episodes. And oftentimes this will look like very suspicious thinking, like someone's watching them and someone's following them, or when one of their partners leaves the house, they'll think that they're out having an affair on them all the time. So it's not a common one, but we are getting a better handle on how to manage that, but it's not necessarily one of the easier symptoms of the disease to manage. So some of the emotional or behavioral impairments would be short-temperedness, depression, apathy. Sometimes they can be verbal abuse or outbursts or assaultive behavior. There can be a general irritability, so it doesn't take a lot to kind of get them fueled up. Again, psychosis is rare. There often is mood swings. People can go from 5 minutes loving somebody to 5 minutes telling them that they hate them and that they're horrible people. The last one is suicide, and I knock on wood every time I talk about this one because, again, I think because we're doing a much better job of intervening in an earlier way and supporting people with HD, the suicide rate is not nearly as high as it might have been in the past. Now, this is kind of taking a little turn now with all of the death with dignity and assisted suicide talk that's happening. So far, that still is not a significant issue for us at this point. And my thought is that with the assisted suicide, there may be some people who choose that route, but I don't feel it's going to be like a huge number of people. So over 33% of the HD people develop psychiatric symptoms as the initial manifestations of the illness. And up to 73% of HD persons have dual diagnoses. So again, this is an extremely important area to pay attention to because these things can cause significant breakdown in relationship and in work opportunities. And again, we really like to get in there early to try to help maintain these people at a high level of function so that they can be plugged into all of the roles of their life for as long as they are able, because that just increases most people's qualities of lives. So the Huntington Society of Canada has dedicated itself to raising awareness and support to those affected by HD and their families. In addition, it is a very strong commitment to funding research aimed at finding treatments for HD. The Family Services Program, within which I am part of, offers direct support services to families, education and support to the community, local community development, and support to the HSC's national advocacy efforts. As Sherry indicated initially, in my role as the Southwestern Ontario Resource Centre Director, I support 10 counties within Southwestern Ontario. Currently, I co-facilitate a support group once per month in London, and I work very closely with 2 movement disorder neurologists in London. In addition, I provide in-services and care planning support to many long-term care facilities within my areas. And to be honest, that's one of my favorite parts of the job. At this point in time, there is no cure, unfortunately, for Huntington's, nor is there a treatment. Some symptoms can be managed with medication, but there is no stopping the disease process. I'm excited to share with you all, however, that we're in an exciting time, and that in October 2014, it was announced that 5 new clinical trials focusing on the treatment of this disease will be launched within the year 2015. One of the clinical trials aims to test a Huntington-lowering therapy that attacks mutant Huntington directly. This is the first ever human HD trial to fight HD at the root of the problem, and has shown to great promise in animal models thus far. Therefore, obviously not only for the science world, but also for those of us living with people in our lives that have HD, this is an extremely exciting and hopeful time, and it gives me great pleasure to continue to work for an organization that allows me to do the work that I do. So before wrapping up, I wanted to see if there's any other questions out there that I could address.
We don't have any questions right now, Corey, but we do have 2 poll questions, if you'd like to go ahead with those.
Okay.
Okay. Here's our first question.
Now to answer that, this is my contact information, and feel free to give me a call or to email me if you have any specific questions, or if you would like an in-service setup for your organization, or if there's anything I can do to help support. The Society has some amazing written resources online that you can view online, and or I can send you hard copies of those if that would be helpful.
Going to give another couple minutes for a couple seconds for people to cast their vote here. Okay. And I'll share that one with everybody. Corey, did you want to comment on this question?
And what's the question?
HD, often the physical symptoms are the most challenging for the living with HD.
Okay, so no. I would say that for most people, particularly families and the individuals with HD, the behavioral or the cognitive challenges are much more distressing than the physical symptoms.
Okay, and we've got our last question here, which I'll be posting. And this one, Corey, is what are the common cognitive symptoms in HD? And I'll give everyone a couple minutes or so to answer this one. Okay, it seems everyone has clicked all of the above.
That's the right answer.
Okay, I don't see any questions right now. So Corey, thank you for your presentation, giving us a better understanding of HD. Please feel free to contact Corey with any questions. For more information on the Huntington Society of Canada, please visit their website at www.huntingtonsociety.ca. Thank you again to the Sifton Family Foundation for funding this webinar series. I encourage you to visit the yearofthebrain2015.com website for other webinars in this series. Have a great day.